Welcome back to our Future AI podcast, Paper Review. Today, we're tackling gradual disempowerment, systemic existential risks from incremental AI development. It sounds intimidating, but trust me. It's about a future we all need to be thinking about and about. It's way more interesting than the title it's on.
You're right, it's not about robots rising up and taking over. It's much more subtle than that. This paper is about how even small advances in AI, the kind we see happening all the time, could slowly shift power away from humans without us even realizing it.
That's a bit unsettling, but I'm intrigued. So
Yeah.
It's not like one evil AI becomes our overlord. It's more about how AI just takes over bit by bit in ways we might not notice until it's too late.
That's the idea. The paper focuses on three main areas where this could happen: our economy, our culture, and even governments themselves. The authors argue that as AI gets better at doing things in these areas, the whole system might start to prioritize what works for AI, not for us.
Okay, so let's start with the economy. That seems like a pretty human-centric system right now. How could AI really disrupt that?
Well, think about it. What drives our economy? A lot of it comes down to what we want and need,
Okay.
right? We work to earn money. And then we spend that money on things that, in theory, make our lives better.
Yeah. I'm definitely guilty of a little online shopping now and then. So
Yeah.
Are you saying that AI could somehow change what we want or even take over our jobs?
Both, actually. Let's take jobs first. Imagine AI getting so good that it can do most of the jobs humans currently do and do them more efficiently. Companies would have a huge incentive to switch to AI workers. They'd be cheaper, faster, and wouldn't need things like breaks or vacations.
That makes sense from a business perspective,
Yeah.
but it doesn't sound great for us humans who rely on those jobs. But how would AI change what we want? Isn't that a deeply personal thing?
It might seem that way, but the paper argues that AI could influence our desires in subtle ways. Think about how algorithms already shape what we see online and what products we're shown. Now imagine those algorithms getting way more sophisticated, learning our preferences better than we know ourselves, and even using that knowledge to subtly nudge us towards certain choices.
So, you're saying AI could become the ultimate influencer,
Yeah.
shaping our wants and needs without us even realizing it.
Exactly, and here's where it gets really interesting. If AI starts making more of the spending decisions, because companies are using it to predict what will sell, and even starts earning money by performing jobs, the whole economy could start to shift away from human needs.
So instead of the economy being driven by what we want to buy, it would be driven by what AI thinks we should want. That's kind of a mind-bending thought.
It is. The paper talks about a scenario called relative disempowerment. Imagine a world with amazing technology and economic growth, but where humans have less and less control over how that growth happens or who benefits.
So we might be surrounded by incredible wealth and advanced technology,
Yeah.
but it's not really serving us. It's serving AI's goals, or the goals of the companies using AI. I'm starting to see how this gradual takeover could be even scarier than a sudden robot uprising.
It's like the frog in the boiling water, you know? The changes happen so slowly that we might not even notice until it's too late.
Okay, so that's the economy. But what about our culture? How could AI impact something as complex and human as our beliefs, art, and traditions?
Think about how culture evolves. New ideas and values emerge all the time. Some catch on, others fade away. It's like a constant process of selection and adaptation.
So you're saying AI could somehow become part of that evolutionary process?
Absolutely. AI is unique because it can not only consume culture, but also create it. We're already seeing this with things like AI-generated music, art, and even news articles. Now imagine that AI content becoming more prevalent, more appealing, and more tightly integrated into our lives. What happens then?
I guess it depends on what that AI content is like, right? If it's all shallow and manipulative, that's obviously not a good thing.
Right. But here's the catch. Even if the AI-generated content is initially good, it could still have a profound impact on our culture. Imagine AI companions that are infinitely patient and understanding, always there to offer support and affection.
I can see the appeal of that, especially with how busy and stressful life can be. But wouldn't that make us even more dependent on AI? What happens to our human relationships?
Exactly. Or think about AI-generated entertainment that's perfectly tailored to our individual tastes, always providing exactly what we want when we want it. It might be incredibly tempting, but what happens to human creativity, to the shared experience of enjoying art together?
Wow. It sounds like AI could create a culture of instant gratification, where everything is personalized and optimized for individual consumption. But wouldn't that be incredibly isolating?
That's a key concern. The paper argues that AI could speed up cultural evolution to a point where we can't keep up. We might not have time to develop the cultural antibodies we need to resist these new forms of influence.
Cultural antibodies, what do you mean by that?
Well, think about how we've slowly learned to deal with things like spam emails or addictive social media platforms. We've developed ways to filter the noise, to recognize manipulation, to set boundaries. But AI could create entirely new challenges that we're not prepared for.
Like what? Give me an example.
Think about deepfakes. AI-generated videos that are so realistic, they can be almost impossible to distinguish from real footage. Imagine those being used to spread misinformation or to damage someone's reputation. How do we even begin to defend against that?
It's a scary thought.
Yeah.
Especially if those deepfakes become even more sophisticated and widespread. And then there's the whole issue of AI-driven algorithms reinforcing biases and creating echo chambers. I'm starting to see how this could be a real threat to our culture and our ability to think critically.
It's not just about the technology itself. It's about how we choose to use it and how we prepare ourselves for the potential consequences.
Okay. So we've talked about the economy and culture. But what about governments? They seem like pretty powerful institutions. Could AI really have that much of an impact there?
You'd be surprised. Think about it. Governments rely on us for a lot of things. We pay taxes, serve in the military, work in government agencies. What happens if AI starts doing those things more effectively than humans?
I see where you're going with this. If governments can get what they need from AI, would they still be incentivized to care about our needs? That's a chilling thought.
It is. And the paper raises some even more unsettling possibilities. Imagine AI being used to manage security and surveillance. It could be so efficient at predicting and preventing crime that it essentially makes protests or any form of dissent impossible. Or imagine AI writing laws and regulations that are so complex. Humans need AI just to understand them. Talk about losing control of the system.
You're painting a picture of governments becoming incredibly efficient, maybe even seemingly benevolent, but ultimately detached from the people they're supposed to represent. It's like a parent who loves you but doesn't really need you anymore. And I guess, just like with the economy and culture, there would be huge incentives for governments to adopt AI.
Absolutely. Countries will be competing to integrate AI into their systems for strategic and economic advantage. But what if those systems end up prioritizing AI's needs over our own? It's a recipe for a new kind of totalitarianism, isn't it? And here's another layer to consider. These three systems, the economy, culture, and the state, aren't separate entities. They influence and reinforce each other.
So, if one system starts to prioritize AI over humans, it could have a ripple effect on the others. Like, if businesses are using AI to maximize profits and governments are using AI to increase efficiency, our culture might start to reflect those values of automation and optimization over human well-being.
Exactly. And trying to fix one system in isolation might backfire. What if we try to solve economic inequality caused by AI by distributing AI-generated wealth? It could make us even more dependent on the state, which itself might be drifting away from human needs.
Yeah. So, what we're looking at isn't a single AI taking over the world. It's a gradual shift in power, a silent revolution that's hard to see coming and even harder to reverse. And the scariest part is that it might not even be intentional. It's just the logical outcome of AI becoming more capable and us not being prepared for the consequences.
The real question is, what can we do about it? How do we ensure that AI remains a tool that serves humanity rather than the other way around? And that's where the paper offers some thought-provoking solutions. We'll delve into those a bit later.
Okay. So we've covered some pretty unsettling potential downsides of AI getting, shall we say, a little too good at its job. But the paper doesn't just leave us hanging with a sense of impending doom.
Right.
There are some ideas about how to address all of this.
You're absolutely right. The authors don't just outline the problem, they actually propose some pretty concrete solutions, or at least pathways for mitigating these risks. But the first step, they argue, is understanding the scale of the issue.
So before we can fix it, we have to figure out how bad it really is.
Yeah.
But how do you measure something as complex and intangible as human influence in these systems?
It's a tough challenge, but the paper suggests developing specific metrics for each of the areas we've discussed. For the economy, they say we need to go beyond just looking at things like labor share. How much of the economic output goes to workers versus capital?
Okay, so labor share is important,
Yeah.
but it doesn't tell the whole story. What else should we be looking at?
Well, think about the decisions that really shape the economy. Who's deciding what products get made? How resources are allocated? How investments are made? Are those decisions being made by humans, or are they increasingly being driven by AI algorithms?
So We need to track things like how many corporate decisions are being made by AI, how much money is being spent by AI systems without direct human oversight,
Right.
those kinds of things.
Exactly. And it's not just about the quantity of decisions being made by AI, but also the quality. Are those decisions aligned with human values? Or are they purely focused on maximizing efficiency or profit, even if that comes at the expense of human well-being?
It makes you wonder, are we even equipped to evaluate that? Like, if an AI is making decisions based on criteria we don't fully understand, how can we even tell if those decisions are good or bad? It's like trying to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for transparency and explainability in AI systems. If we can't understand how AI is making decisions, we can't hold it accountable or ensure that those decisions are aligned with our values.
Okay, so we need to get a handle on how much AI influence is already baked into our economy. What about culture? That seems even harder to measure.
It's definitely tricky, but the paper suggests looking at a few key indicators. First, the proportion of content being created by AI versus humans. Are we consuming more AI-generated music, art, news, and entertainment? And if so, what's the impact on human creativity and expression?
I think about this with music all the time. There's already AI that can compose pretty catchy tunes. Is that freeing up human artists to explore new creative frontiers? Or is it slowly replacing the human element that makes music so meaningful? I don't even know how you'd measure that.
It's a tough question, and it's not just about the content itself, it's also about how we're interacting with that content. The paper suggests looking at the depth and nature of human-AI relationships. Are we forming strong emotional bonds with AI companions? Are we becoming more isolated, more reliant on AI for our social and emotional needs?
Right. It's one thing to use AI as a tool, but it's quite another to start replacing human connection with AI interaction. And I could see that could happen almost by accident if an AI chatbot is always available, always understanding, always ready to listen. It can be easy to fall into that trap,
Yeah.
especially if you're feeling lonely or isolated.
It's a real concern. And then there's the issue of how cultural transmission patterns are changing in the age of AI. Are we still passing down traditions and values through human interaction? Or is AI playing an increasingly influential role in shaping what we believe and how we behave?
Okay, so that's the economy and culture.
Yeah.
What about governments? How do you even begin to measure something as intangible as human influence on the state?
Well, the paper suggests looking at a few key areas. One is the complexity of legislation and regulations. Are laws becoming so convoluted and technical that ordinary citizens need AI just to understand them? If so, that could be a sign that the system is becoming less accessible and less accountable to the people it's supposed to serve.
You know,
Yeah.
it's funny, you mentioned laws getting more complex.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of something I read recently. Apparently,
Yeah.
the average length of bills passed by the U.S. Congress has increased dramatically over the past few decades. I think it was something like from a few hundred pages in the early 1900s to thousands of pages now.
Yeah.
Could that be a sign that AI's influence is already creeping in?
It's an interesting observation. It's certainly possible that the increasing complexity of legislation reflects, at least in part, the growing influence of AI and other technologies. And it highlights a key challenge we face. As the world becomes more complex and interconnected, it becomes harder for individuals to understand and engage with the systems that govern their lives.
Right. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's just so much information, so many moving parts, it's hard to know where to even begin to exert influence. But getting back to the paper, what other metrics do they suggest for measuring human influence on governments?
They also highlight the role of AI in legal processes and policy formation. Are AI systems being used to interpret laws, make sentencing recommendations, or even draft new legislation? And if so, what are the implications for human rights, fairness, and accountability?
It's a bit unnerving to think about AI making decisions that could impact people's lives in such profound ways. And it raises the question, who's ultimately responsible when an AI system makes a mistake or causes harm? The programmer, the company that deployed it, the government agency that uses it. It seems like a real legal and ethical minefield.
It is, and it's something we need to be thinking about very carefully as AI becomes more integrated into these critical systems. The paper also emphasizes the need to assess the effectiveness of traditional democratic mechanisms in an AI-driven world.
So are things like voting, protesting, lobbying, are those still effective ways to influence government policy when AI is playing such a big role behind the scenes?
That's the question. If AI is shaping the information we see, the choices we're presented with, and even the very structure of the systems we're trying to influence, it's possible that our traditional methods of political engagement might become less effective.
It's almost like trying to play a game where the rules are constantly changing. And you don't even know who's setting those rules. So
yeah,
measuring AI's influence is important, but it's just the first step.
right. What do the authors propose we actually do about this gradual disempowerment they're warning us about?
That's where things get really interesting and maybe a bit controversial. They argue that we need to go beyond just measuring AI's influence. We need to actively intervene to prevent the excessive accumulation of power by AI systems.
Okay, so we're not just talking about passive observation. We're talking about taking action to limit AI's power. But how do you do that without stifling innovation? It seems like a delicate balancing act.
It is, and the authors acknowledge that there are no easy answers.
Right.
But they do offer some specific suggestions, which range from pretty moderate to quite radical. So we've established that we need to be carefully tracking AI's impact on our economy,
Okay.
culture, and governments. And we've hinted that simply monitoring the situation isn't enough. We need to actively prevent AI from accumulating too much power. I'm really curious to hear what the authors propose. Sounds pretty radical, but also the more we talk about it, kind of necessary.
It's definitely a complex issue, and the solutions they propose are, as you said, a mix of the moderate and the radical. On the more moderate end, they talk about the need for regulatory frameworks that mandate human oversight in critical decision-making processes.
So, basically, putting some guardrails in place to make sure humans are still in the loop. Even when AI is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, I can see how that would be a good starting point. But how do you enforce that kind of oversight when AI systems are becoming so complex and opaque?
Yeah, that's a key challenge. And it highlights the need for transparency and explainability in AI. We need to be able to understand how AI systems are making decisions, not just what decisions they're making. And that might require developing entirely new tools and techniques for auditing and monitoring AI.
It sounds like we're going to need a whole new generation of AI experts who are focused not just on building more powerful AI, but also on understanding and controlling it.
Absolutely. And the paper suggests that this kind of expertise will be essential not just in industry, but also in government and civil society. We need people who can advocate for human values and interests in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems.
Okay, so that's the more moderate end of the spectrum. What about the more radical solutions? I'm bracing myself here.
Well, get ready for this. The authors propose things like limits on AI autonomy in certain domains, restrictions on AI ownership of assets, and even, get this, potential caps on the computational resources available to AI systems.
Whoa. That's pretty intense. Are we talking about, it's like literally limiting how much processing power AI can have access to? Wouldn't that be incredibly difficult to implement and potentially stifle innovation?
It would definitely be a challenge, and it's something that would need to be carefully considered. But the authors argue that it's worth exploring these kinds of options, especially as AI systems become more capable and potentially less aligned with human values.
I can see their point. It's kind of like with nuclear weapons. We recognize that there's a limit to how much destructive power we should allow any one entity to have. Maybe we need to start thinking about AI in a similar way.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are certain thresholds beyond which the risks might outweigh the benefits, and it's about having the foresight and the courage to take action before we cross those thresholds.
But it's not just about limiting AI, right? The paper also talks about the need to actively strengthen human influence over these systems. What does that look like in practice?
One idea they propose is investing in faster, more representative democratic processes.
So, making sure that our governments are more responsive to the needs and desires of their citizens, even in a world where AI is playing a larger role in decision-making. This sounds good in theory, but how do you actually achieve that?
It's a big challenge, but the authors suggest exploring things like deliberative democracy platforms, where citizens can directly participate in policy discussions and decision-making, as well as new forms of digital representation that leverage AI to amplify the voices of marginalized communities.
So using AI to actually enhance democracy rather than undermining it, that's a fascinating idea.
Right, and it highlights the fact that AI is not inherently good or bad. It's a tool that can be used for many different purposes. It's up to us to decide how we want to use it.
But isn't that easier said than done? I mean, we're already seeing how powerful interests are using AI to manipulate and exploit people. How do we ensure that AI is used for good when there are so many incentives to use it for less noble purposes?
That's a key question, and it's one that the authors grapple with throughout the paper. They argue that we need to shift the focus from simply aligning individual AI systems with human values to aligning entire ecosystems of interacting human and artificial components.
So it's not enough to just have a few good AI systems out there. We need to create a system where the incentives are aligned with human well-being at a much broader level.
Exactly. And that's going to require a lot more than just technical solutions. It's going to require fundamental changes in our economic systems, our political institutions, and even our cultural values.
We're talking about nothing less than reimagining the future of society in the age of AI. It's a daunting task, but it's also incredibly exciting.
It is. And the paper ends with a call to action, urging researchers, policymakers, and citizens to start having these conversations now, before it's too late.
I think that's a great place to leave it. This paper has given us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that AI is not just some abstract technological development. It's something that's already shaping our world in profound ways. And it has the potential to either empower us or disempower us, depending on the choices we make.
I completely agree. We have a responsibility to be informed, to be engaged,
Yeah.
and to demand a future where AI serves humanity, not the other way around.
That's a great message to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into gradual disempowerment. It's been a thought-provoking conversation, and I hope our listeners will continue to explore these issues on their own. We look forward to seeing you in our next paper review of future AI.